The large auditorium was packed tight, filled with row after row of people fanning themselves with folded programs. The air inside felt heavy and warm, smelling faintly of old popcorn, floor wax, and the perfume of too many people squeezed into one space. It was the final night of the city's annual talent showcase, a long event that had started early in the morning. By now, the audience was tired. They had sat through hours of magic tricks that went wrong, dance recitals with missteps, and poetry readings that were too quiet to hear. The excitement from the start of the day had faded, replaced by a restless, grumpy energy. People were checking their watches, shifting in their hard seats, and whispering to their neighbors about when they could finally go home. Up on stage, the previous act, a man trying to juggle flaming torches, had just finished to a mix of polite clapping and a few groans. He hurried off stage looking relieved, and the lights dimmed slightly. The master of ceremonies walked back to the microphone, smiling too brightly, trying to keep the energy up. He announced the next performer, a young woman named Clara, but his voice sounded tired, too. There was no special music for her entrance. No dramatic spotlight. She simply walked out from the heavy velvet curtains on the side of the stage. Clara looked small against the huge backdrop of the stage. She didn't look like the polished performers who had been there earlier in the evening. She wasn't wearing a sparkly dress or a fancy suit. Instead, she wore a simple, plain skirt that looked a bit faded and a loose blouse with the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her hair was pulled back tightly into a bun, held in place with what looked like a simple pencil, and she didn't have a drop of makeup on her face. She looked like someone who had just finished a long day at work and had hurried over to sing a song before going home to sleep. As she walked toward the center of the stage, the noise level in the auditorium didn't go down like it usually did for a performance. In fact, it seemed to get louder. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, like a wave of dissatisfaction. People in the front rows leaned back in their seats, crossing their arms. From the back, someone shouted, "Hurry it up!" followed by a few scattered laughs. It was a harsh sound, echoing off the high ceiling. Another voice, closer to the stage, mumbled loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "Not another amateur. I want to go home." Clara kept walking, her eyes fixed on the microphone stand at the center of the stage. She didn't look at the crowd, but anyone watching closely could see her hands trembling slightly at her sides. She looked nervous. Alone. She didn't have a guitar, a piano, or a backing band. She was just one person standing on a massive wooden stage, facing hundreds of tired, grumpy strangers who had already decided they didn't like her. She reached the microphone and reached out to adjust the height. The metal stand squeaked loudly, creating a sharp, high-pitched noise that made everyone in the first few rows wince. "Sorry," she whispered into the mic, her voice so soft and shaky that it barely came through the speakers. Instead of patience, the whisper was met with more shuffling. A man wearing a gray suit, one of the three judges sitting at a long table in the center of the room, didn't even look up. He was busy writing something on a piece of paper, probably a grocery list, looking bored out of his mind. The female judge next to him was rubbing her temples, her eyes closed, as if she had a headache. The message was clear, they didn't expect much. They were ready for her to fail. The atmosphere in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. It felt like the entire auditorium was holding its breath, waiting for a mistake so they could justify booing or laughing. It is a cruel thing that happens sometimes in crowds, a collective impatience that turns people mean. They wanted her to be bad. They wanted her to mess up so they could say, "See, I told you this wasn't worth watching," and finally leave. Clara stood there for a moment, the bright stage lights shining down on her face, making her squint. She looked out into the darkness of the audience, but she couldn't see faces clearly, just rows of silhouettes. She adjusted the microphone one more time, taking a deep, shaky breath that made her shoulders rise and fall. The sound engineer in the back booth waited for her cue to start the music, but Clara just stood there. The silence stretched on, second after second. The crowd grew louder, the whispers turning into open conversations. The mood was toxic. It felt like the entire room wanted her to just turn around and walk off stage without singing a single note. Then, something changed in Clara's posture. She stopped fidgeting with her hair. She stopped gripping the microphone stand with a white-knuckled grip. She straightened her back. She looked down at her feet for a brief second, as if gathering courage from somewhere deep inside, and then she looked back up. She closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the glaring lights and the judgment of the crowd. She opened her mouth, not to speak, but to make a sound. The auditorium was still loud, still buzzing with rude comments and restless movements, but she was about to fill that space with something none of them expected. The bright stage lights felt even hotter now, beating down on Clara's face like a heavy weight. She took a moment to steady herself, gripping the microphone stand with both hands to stop them from shaking. She leaned in close, her lips almost touching the mesh of the mic, and spoke her first words to the impatient crowd. "Hello everyone," she said. Her voice was small and thin, sounding a bit shaky over the loudspeakers that echoed around the large hall. "My name is Clara, and tonight I'm going to sing a song that means a lot to me." She paused, waiting for a reaction. Usually, even a polite crowd will give a little clap or a nod of encouragement when a performer introduces themselves. But tonight, the silence was brutal. It was that heavy, awkward kind of silence where you can hear people coughing and shifting in their seats. No one clapped. In fact, a few people in the back rows didn't even stop their conversations. They just kept talking loudly, their voices floating up to the stage, completely ignoring her. Clara swallowed hard, her throat feeling dry and tight. She could feel the sweat forming on her forehead, but she didn't dare wipe it away. She turned her head slightly to the side and gave a thumbs up to the sound booth at the back of the room. This was the cue. For weeks, she had practiced with a specific backing track, a soft, instrumental version of her song that she had carefully edited on her computer. She had emailed the file to the theater technicians 3 days ago just to be safe, and she had brought a USB drive as a backup. She was ready. All she needed was for the music to start. She stood there, waiting for the first familiar note of the piano to fill the air. 1 second passed. Then 2. Then 5. Nothing happened. The speakers remained silent. Only the low, dull hum of the electricity buzzed through the room. Clara stood frozen, her thumb still up in the air, looking confused. She looked back at the sound booth, a small glass room high up on the back wall. Inside, she could see the sound engineer waving his hands frantically. He was typing on his computer, his face lit by the glow of the screen, looking stressed. He was switching buttons and checking cables, but no music was coming out. The mood in the auditorium shifted instantly. The restlessness that had been bubbling under the surface suddenly boiled over. The silence wasn't just boring anymore, it was annoying. People started to stamp their feet. A low groan rolled through the rows of seats, sounding like a large engine starting up. Suddenly, the master of ceremonies rushed back onto the stage. He didn't look happy. He grabbed his microphone from the stand, his jacket flapping as he moved. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a small technical delay," he announced, his voice tight. "Please bear with us for just a moment." "Get on with it?" a man shouted from the balcony. His voice was deep and angry, cutting through the room. "We don't have all night." "Yeah, let us go." Someone else chimed in from the floor seats. The booze started. It wasn't a loud, violent riot, but it was a dismissive, rude sound. A few people stood up, pretending to leave just to make a point. The judges at the long table in the center were looking openly frustrated now. The man in the gray suit threw his pen down onto the table with a loud clatter. He shook his head at the woman next to him, rolling his eyes. They were done waiting. It was clear they had already written Clara off as a waste of time. To them, she wasn't a brave young woman anymore, she was just a glitch in their schedule. Clara stood there, alone in the center of the storm. She felt her face burning hot with embarrassment. She wanted the floor to just open up and swallow her. This was every singer's worst nightmare, standing on stage, ready to perform, and being told you can't, all while hundreds of people stare at you with annoyance. She looked at the sound booth again. The technician was holding up his hands, palms open, in a shrug. He mouthed the words, "I can't find it." It was gone. The file was corrupted, or lost, or deleted. Her safety net was gone. The master of ceremonies leaned toward Clara, speaking quietly so the microphone wouldn't pick it up. "Look, I'm sorry," he whispered, looking pained. "We can't fix this quickly. Do you want to step off? We can come back to you later if we fix it, or maybe not at all." It was an exit door. A way to escape. If she walked off now, she could escape the angry stares and the booing. She could go home, cry, and forget this night ever happened. It was the easy thing to do. It was the smart thing to do. Clara looked out at the crowd. She saw the man with his arms crossed, scowling. She saw the people checking their phones. She saw the judges looking at their watches. They wanted her to leave. They wanted her off the stage. A strange feeling suddenly washed over her. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a spark of something else, a sudden, stubborn refusal to let them win. She hadn't come all this way, practiced all those hours, just to walk away because of a computer error. She knew this song. She knew it in her head, in her heart, and in her bones. She didn't need a computer to tell her when to breathe or when to sing. She was a singer, and singers sing. She pulled the microphone out of the stand. It made a loud popping sound that made a few people jump. She stepped forward, right to the very edge of the stage. The master of ceremonies looked surprised and took a step back, unsure of what she was doing. Clara closed her eyes for a second, blocking out the harsh lights and the angry faces. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs completely. When she opened her eyes again, they weren't looking at the judges or the exits. She was looking straight ahead, at nothing in particular, focusing entirely on the music inside her head. "No," she said, her voice still quiet, but firmer than before. The master of ceremonies looked at her, confused. She turned her head slightly toward the microphone, making sure her voice would reach the back of the room. "It's okay," Clara said, a small, brave smile touching her lips. "I don't need it. I'll just sing without it." She didn't wait for the announcer to leave or for the crowd to settle. She just stood there, feet shoulder width apart, holding the microphone with both hands, and waited for the silence. The rude comments died down slightly, replaced by a confused murmur. People looked at each other, eyebrows raised. Was she serious without music in this big hall? It sounded crazy. It sounded like a disaster waiting to happen. But Clara didn't care what it sounded like. She knew the melody. She found her starting note in her head, took a breath, and opened her mouth to sing. The silence that filled the auditorium was heavy and uncomfortable, but Clara didn't rush to break it. She stood with her feet planted firmly on the wooden floorboards, her eyes closed for a brief second longer. She wasn't thinking about the hundreds of eyes glaring at her anymore. She wasn't thinking about the judges who wanted to go home. In her mind, she was back in her small apartment, standing in front of her bathroom mirror, singing to the tiles just for the joy of it. She blocked out the lights, the dust, and the bad smell of the room. Then, she opened her mouth, and the first note came out. It wasn't a shy sound. It wasn't the shaky, nervous whisper she had used when introducing herself. It was a sound that was deep, rich, and incredibly clear. It seemed to cut through the thick air of the room like a knife, sharp and precise. The note hung in the air, vibrating against the high ceiling and bouncing off the back walls. For a split second, nobody moved. The effect was like a physical splash of cold water on a hot day. It was so unexpected that it caused a chain reaction of dropped jaws. The man who had been shouting rude jokes in the back row froze with his mouth open, the words dying in his throat. The woman who had been loudly complaining about her dinner reservation stopped speaking mid-sentence. Even the judges, who had been looking at their paperwork or checking their phones, snapped their heads up in unison. The sound of Clara's voice was pure. Without the backing of drums or guitars to hide behind, there was nowhere for any imperfection to hide. Usually, when a singer performs a cappella, they are afraid of missing a note or going out of tune, especially in a hall this big. But Clara hit the note with a confidence that seemed impossible for someone who looked so nervous just a moment ago. Her voice didn't just fill the room, it seemed to wrap around the audience, commanding their attention without asking for permission. She moved from the first note into the melody of the song. It was a soulful ballad, a song that was usually sung with a full orchestra to build up the drama. But stripped down to just a voice, it felt even more powerful. It felt intimate, like she was standing right next to each person in the crowd and singing directly to them. The acoustics of the auditorium, which had been making the noise of the crowd sound messy and loud, were now working in her favor. They amplified the natural warmth in her tone, making it sound like she was surrounded by invisible harmonies. The change in the room was physical to watch. The hostility that had been hanging like a dark cloud over the stage began to evaporate. People who had been leaning back in their seats with their arms crossed defensively slowly started to lean forward. The energy in the room shifted from get off the stage to what is happening right now. A young girl sitting near the front, who had been fidgeting and playing with a toy car, stopped moving. She looked up at the stage with wide eyes, completely captured by the sound. In the balcony, a group of teenagers who had been laughing and pointing at Clara's plain clothes went quiet. One of them elbowed the other, not to mock her this time, but to point, as if to say, "Listen to that." As Clara sang the first verse, her voice gained strength. She wasn't just hitting the notes, she was feeling them. You could see it in the way she held her shoulders, the way her fingers moved slightly against the microphone stand. The fear that had paralyzed her earlier was being replaced by something else: passion. It was as if the moment she started singing, she remembered exactly why she loved music. It wasn't about the competition or the judges. It was about the connection. The song required a difficult jump in pitch halfway through the verse, a transition that made even professional singers nervous. The crowd held its collective breath. If she missed this, the spell would break, and the impatience would come rushing back. But Clara didn't miss it. She slid into the higher note smoothly, effortlessly, her voice soaring up without cracking. She held the high note, letting it ring out pure and steady. It was that moment that the skepticism completely died. The man in the gray suit, the judge who had been so bored earlier, let his pen drop from his hand and roll across the table. He didn't pick it up. He just stared at the stage, his eyebrows raised high, looking genuinely stunned. The female judge beside him stopped rubbing her temples. She uncrossed her arms and sat up straight, her focus entirely locked on the young woman standing alone on the stage. There was no safety net here. There was no bass guitar to cover a mistake, no drums to keep the rhythm. It was just Clara and her voice, exposed and vulnerable in front of hundreds of people. And that was exactly why it was so gripping. The audience realized that she was taking a massive risk. They could feel the courage radiating off her. In a world where so much of entertainment is auto-tuned and perfected by computers, hearing a raw, unfiltered human voice hitting perfect notes was shocking. The silence in the auditorium changed quality again. It was no longer a silence of waiting or boredom. It was a silence of awe. You could literally hear the air conditioning humming in the background because no one was making a sound. Even the people standing in the lobby who had left their seats to buy snacks stopped walking and peered through the open double doors at the back, drawn in by the sound. Clara kept her eyes closed for most of the verse, lost in the world of the song, but as she approached the chorus, she opened them. She looked out, but she didn't see the angry faces she had feared. She saw a sea of people who were suddenly on her side. The tension that had been crushing her chest just moments ago was gone, replaced by the music. She took a deep breath, preparing for the chorus, and the audience watched, captivated, waiting to see where she would take them next. The girl they wanted off stage had just seized control of the entire room without saying a single word. As Clara moved into the chorus, her voice didn't just get louder, it got bigger. It seemed to grow in size, filling every corner of the vast hall until there was nowhere left for the sound to go. The song was building up, gaining momentum like a wave rising in the ocean, and Clara rode that wave perfectly. She lifted her chin slightly, opening her mouth wider to let the sound pour out freely. It was a rich, powerful tone that seemed to vibrate in people's chests. You didn't just hear her sing, you could feel the resonance of her voice in your own body. She wasn't stuck in one spot anymore. The nervousness that had glued her feet to the floor had vanished completely. She began to use the stage, moving with a fluid, natural grace. She stepped away from the microphone stand, holding the mic in one hand, and walked toward the left edge of the stage. Then, she turned and walked back to the center, her movements slow and deliberate, perfectly matching the rhythm of the music she was creating in her head. It looked like she was finally comfortable in her own skin, transforming from the shy girl who walked out minutes ago into a true performer who owned the space. The truly amazing part was what she was doing with her voice. Since she didn't have any instruments or a backing track, she started to make the music herself. It was a display of raw, incredible talent. Between the lines of the main melody, she would quietly hum a deep, steady beat thump thump, thump thump. It sounded like a bass drum or a cello providing a foundation for the song. Then, on top of that humming and the main lyrics, she would suddenly throw in a high, piercing harmony note that floated above everything else. She was essentially singing three different parts at the same time, the bass, the melody, and the harmony. It was a complex, difficult technique that usually takes years to master, yet she made it look effortless. The audience was watching a one-woman choir perform right in front of their eyes. The impact on the judges was instant and visible. The three people at the long table, who had been bored and impatient just a few minutes ago, were now completely focused. The man in the gray suit was leaning so far forward that his elbows were resting on the table, his hands clasped tightly under his chin. He wasn't looking at his watch anymore. He wasn't rolling his eyes. He was staring at Clara with a look of intense concentration, his mouth slightly open, as if he was trying to figure out how a human voice could make those sounds. The female judge beside him had uncrossed her arms. She was sitting up straight, her eyes wide, following Clara's every move across the stage. They were no longer judging her, they were witnessing something special. In the back rows, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The group of teenagers who had been laughing and checking their phones were now dead silent. One of them, a boy with a backwards baseball cap, slowly lowered his phone. He had been recording a video to mock her, but he pressed stop and just watched. The screen on his phone went black, forgotten in his hand. The man who had shouted next earlier was now leaning against the wall, his arms crossed not in anger, but in thought. He looked confused, as if he couldn't believe that the girl he wanted to boo off stage was the one producing this beautiful sound. The hostility had evaporated, replaced by a stunned reverence. It wasn't just the technical skill that captivated everyone, it was the emotion. Clara wasn't just singing notes, she was telling a story. The song she chose had lyrics about struggle, about feeling small and invisible, and then finding the strength to stand tall. As she sang the words, you could tell she meant them. Her voice cracked slightly on a word about pain, but it didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like she was holding back tears, which made the performance even more powerful and human. It felt raw and honest. In a world where so much of the entertainment we see is polished, auto-tuned, and fake, here was a real person, standing alone, bleeding emotion into a microphone. The air in the room felt electric. It was that rare, magical moment that happens only occasionally in live performances where the connection between the singer and the audience clicks into place. Hundreds of strangers, tired and grumpy just moments before, were now breathing at the same time, feeling the same emotions. They weren't thinking about their jobs, their dinner, or the cold weather outside. They were completely focused on the young woman in the simple clothes pouring her heart out. As the song neared its peak, Clara poured everything she had into it. She closed her eyes again, tilting her head back slightly, letting the high notes soar. She was singing in a range that most professional singers would be terrified to attempt without a backing track to support them, but she hit every note with crystal clear precision. The sound swelled, filling the entire auditorium, bouncing off the high ceiling and the velvet curtains, coming back to envelope her. She held a long, sustained note that required immense breath control. Her chest was still, her shoulders relaxed, showing just how good her technique was. The note hung in the air, steady as a rock, beautiful and pure. The audience was suspended in that moment, completely spellbound. Nobody wanted it to stop. The silence in the room was no longer empty, it was full of awe. The girl they had wanted to leave was now the most important person in the world to them, and she held them all in the palm of her hand with nothing but her voice. Clara held the final note of the song, letting it ring out into the vast space of the auditorium. It was a crystal clear, high note that seemed to float in the air above everyone's heads. She held it steady, her breath controlled and her body perfectly still, showing an immense amount of skill that took years of practice to master. The spotlight caught the dust motes dancing around her, making it look like she was standing in a magical, glowing cloud. Slowly, gently, she lowered the volume of the note, fading it out until it was just a whisper, and then, she let it silence completely. She closed her mouth and lowered her hand, dropping it to her side. For the first 3 seconds, the room was dead silent. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air pressure in the room had changed. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody shifted in their seats. It was as if the entire audience had been collectively holding their breath along with her, and they had forgotten how to let it out. The echo of her voice seemed to linger in the high ceiling, bouncing softly off the walls, a ghost of the beautiful sound they had just heard. The contrast between this heavy, amazed silence and the noisy, rude impatience from just 10 minutes ago was shocking. Clara stood there on stage, her chest rising and falling slightly as she caught her breath. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes searching the darkness. For a moment, she looked terrified again, perhaps wondering if they were silent because they hated it. She stood there, exposed and vulnerable, waiting for a reaction. Then, the spell broke. It started with a single person. An older woman sitting in the third row slowly stood up. She didn't say anything, she just clapped. Clap. 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 It sounded lonely at first, but then, a man in the row behind her stood up and joined in. Then a teenager near the front stood up. Suddenly, like a wave crashing onto a beach, the movement rippled through the entire room. The applause didn't just start, it exploded. It wasn't a polite, golf clap kind of applause. It was a roar of pure joy and amazement. People jumped to their feet by the hundreds. The sound was deafening, a thunderous mix of clapping, cheering, and loud whistling that shook the walls of the old building. The floor seemed to vibrate with the energy of the crowd. The man in the gray suit, the judge who had been so ready to go home earlier, was one of the first to stand up. He wasn't just clapping, he was smiling broadly, shaking his head in disbelief. He looked at the other judges, and they were already standing, too. The cynicism was gone, wiped away by the raw talent they had just witnessed. They held up their scorecards high above their heads. They weren't hiding the scores this time. Every single card showed a big, bold number, 10. Seeing the judges react like that sent the crowd into an even bigger frenzy. The teenage boy in the back, the one who had been on his phone, was now clapping so hard his hands were turning red. The people who had been standing in the lobby rushed back into the auditorium to see who was performing, only to find the song was already over and the place going wild. They joined in the clapping, swept up in the emotion of the moment. On stage, Clara's face changed. The fear washed away, replaced by a look of pure shock and overwhelming happiness. Her hand went to her heart, and a genuine, shy smile broke across her face. It wasn't the smile of a performer acting for a crowd, it was the smile of a girl who realized she had just done something impossible. Tears welled up in her eyes, sparkling under the bright lights. She bowed deeply, not once, but 3 times, turning to the left, the center, and the right, trying to thank every section of the room. The crowd didn't want to let her go. They kept clapping, the sound getting louder instead of fading. Someone shouted, "Encore!" And then the whole room took up the chant. Encore! Encore! They wanted more. They wanted to hear that voice again. But Clara knew she had given everything she had. She wiped a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand and waved one last time. She turned and walked toward the side of the stage. The master of ceramics walked out to center stage, looking at the crowd as if they had gone mad, but he was smiling, too. He pointed to Clara as she exited, giving her the credit she deserved. As Clara stepped off the stage and into the shadows of the wings, the roar of the crowd followed her. Backstage, it was quiet and dimly lit. A few stagehands were standing there, their mouths open, staring at her. They had heard the noise from the audience, and they knew she was the reason for it. One of them, a big man holding a heavy cable, simply nodded at her and whispered, "That was incredible." Clara leaned back against the cool brick wall backstage, sliding down until she sat on the floor. She put her head in her hands and took a deep, shaky breath. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. She thought about the technical failure, the rude shouts, and the feeling of wanting to run away. She had almost given up. But she didn't. She stood her ground, and she let her talent speak for itself. Out in the auditorium, the applause was finally starting to die down, but the mood of the night had changed completely. People didn't leave right away. They stayed in their seats, talking to each other with excitement, reliving the performance. They weren't complaining about being tired anymore. They were buzzing with energy, inspired by what they had seen. Strangers were high-fiving and talking about the girl in the simple clothes who silenced the room with nothing but a song. Clara stood up after a few minutes, wiped her face, and smoothed down her skirt. She picked up her bag from the floor. She didn't walk out of the theater like a conquering hero with her head held high, she walked out like Clara, the same girl who had walked in. But she felt different inside. She knew now that she didn't need fancy lights, a backup track, or a fancy dress to be a star. She just needed her voice and the courage to use it. She walked out of the stage door into the cool night air, leaving behind a stunned audience and a memory they would talk about for years to come. The crowd had wanted her off stage, but she had made sure they would never forget her name.